How did this documentary come together?
Philippe Sands, who is, if you like, the main character of a cast of 3 characters in the movie, is a personal friend of mine. We were at university together. I made documentaries for the BBC, but that's about 20 years ago now. And when he came across this amazing story in the course of researching a book, he asked me if I thought there was sufficient material to make a documentary, and we started off working together on it as friends. And because it started almost as a kind of, I suppose it could have been a vanity project had it not been for the overwhelmingly powerful nature of the material, but because it started off as almost a hobby engaged in by 2 old friends, it started as it then developed in a spirit of great mutual trust and generosity of heart, if you like, and that carried through. So it kind of meant that our relationships with the 2 men whose fathers were senior Nazis also became characterized by a genuine friendliness and warmth. So although some of what is on screen is kind of painful and to some extent confrontational, those moments where the camera was turning were kind of exceptional moments in a 2-year history of a friendship that accommodated basically 4 people: Philippe and me, and Niklas, Frank, and Horst von Wächter.
You, if my reading serves me properly, you started as a documentarian, and then you started doing some feature-length narrative films. Fever Pitch was mentioned earlier, and then television, Downton Abbey. You did say in a previous interview that being a dramatist and doing a lot of narrative films actually helped in the making of this documentary, where you would see these amazing scenes unfold in front of you and you would just let it play out in front of the cameras.
Making drama for 20 years, pretty much, between one documentary and another, was one reason why I kind of embraced this project with such complete joy, because I had no script. And although that's kind of scary, it's also, after being, not to put too fine a point on it, imprisoned by the plans of another agent, suddenly you can make your own movie. And I mean, I didn't realize, but I recognized very quickly I had a real thirst to do that. So that was one thing. To be absolutely honest with you, it has been said of me by Nick Fraser, the series editor of Storyville, who was a big creative component in the making of the film, that it was obviously a documentary made by a dramatist, which he intended as a compliment, but I'm not quite sure, without embarrassing him to try and specify more, I'm not quite sure what he means by that. I think, to be honest, I'm just following my instincts as a filmmaker, as anyone would, and the example that you're bringing to bear of, there are quite a few long scenes like this, but there's one particularly intense scene by a mass grave from a mass execution, where, although it's not quite in real time, there is certainly that feeling that there are very few edits, and essentially each moment of emotional tension between the 3 participants is allowed to unravel at its full length. I'm not sure if it's because I'm used to making drama that I did that. I can't believe that somebody who'd mostly made documentary would have made different decisions. However, I'm prepared to accept the opinion of a wise man that there must be something about the fact that I've made more drama. I mean, maybe something perhaps more general than that, which is that I became most interested in the personalities of the 3 protagonists rather than the historical record, or maybe that's just simply because character is what I do.
Seeing my share of documentaries, I mean, I feel like this film, when I watched it, and several other documentaries we've seen this weekend, your film has modern filmmaking is all very kinetic and cut. I do feel like your film and these scenes give it a real authenticity, where we're just with these 3 gentlemen as they're bringing up these memories and atrocities from the past, and all trying to come to terms with what it means in their present.
The intensity of the film delivers in the second half, when the three men are together, really confronting parts of themselves which they've never done before. And that's a gift. As my extremely talented film editor David Charap said, you can't really make a documentary very well unless something happens in front of the camera. And we could have been in a position where we were making one of those documentaries where nothing was happening right now, in front of the camera, and then all you get is two 75-year-old men and one man who's slightly younger reminiscing effectively about something that has happened, but it's not happening now. And so that's great that something happens now, which is their relationship is meaningful to an audience now. But interestingly, the reason I think why an audience is receptive to that material by the time you reach that portion of the film is more to do with the atmosphere that's generated by the relationship between archive film and memory. That there's something deliberately dreamlike about the earlier sections of the film, which I hope anyway invites the audience to, if you like, lower their intuitive tendency to judge, because we're talking about Nazis. So it's morally barren, this topic, because you can't really envisage a more morally reprehensible group. So there's nowhere to go. But the film works, I hope, to make you feel like you're walking in the shoes of these men, and to some extent walking in the shoes of their fathers, who were the perpetrators of these terrible atrocities. And just for the duration of the film, it invites you to suspend your knowledge of moral certainty. And I think really that the thing that makes the film's particular effect possible is as much the fact that those two contributors gave us access to their archive film, their personal, private archive film. So it feels like you've watched their memories before you come to the point where you're seeing them interact with each other in the moment.
Do you think Niklas, he, as people point out when they watch the film, he absolutely hates his father, and then you have Horst, who is in complete denial of what his father did. Do you think those two will ever reconcile in their heart with, one trying, maybe will never find love for his father, and then the other will finally realize his father was a complete monster?
No. No. There's a moment in the film where Niklas, to our huge surprise, Philippe, I remember we were actually at this location to film something else completely, and Philippe suddenly said, "You won't believe what Niklas has just said to me. Niklas has just said that he thinks Horst is a Nazi," which for somebody of Niklas Frank's depth of understanding of what that means is so far from being a kind of superficial term of abuse that you'd throw at somebody across a room. I mean, my God, his father was Hans Frank, the Governor General of occupied Poland. If he is saying that he thinks this man who he was once pleased to call his friend is a Nazi, it's a very, very serious allegation indeed. So we trotted out onto this funny little ledge thing, and I got them to have the same conversation again in the hope that Nick would say the same thing again. And indeed he did. So we have him in the film saying that he thinks Horst is a Nazi. But what we didn't include in the film is the next statement that Niklas Frank makes, which is he turns to Philippe and says, "And what's more, you've turned him into a Nazi." He's joking slightly, that's why we didn't include it, because the tone is quite wry. He's got a kind of ironic sense of humour, and it's sort of a joke, but it's also sort of true. That whereas Niklas has, to some extent, allowed his life to be bent out of shape by his hatred for his father, so his position is completely intransigent. It has been the same throughout his entire adult life. Not even his entire adult life, his life has been shaped by his hatred for his father. Horst never really had that much interest in any of this until we came along, and that's what the subtextual truth of Nick's allegation is, that Horst has discovered this urge to defend his father's name because he was pushed into it, provoked by this bunch of British filmmakers. But the reason that I can give you such a definitive answer is that process has only hardened and increased as time has gone on, both in the making of the film and subsequently. He's still more now inclined to commit his own time spontaneously to exonerating his father than he was before we ever had anything to do with him.
And one last question. As a very experienced and accomplished filmmaker, did you learn anything about the process or life while going through this journey with these three gentlemen?
Well, perhaps I could refer again to my friendship with Philippe being the underlying factor. And I don't mean this to sound flippant, but when I was an undergraduate, when I first got to know Philippe, I didn't have an awful lot of time for lawyers. And, you know, the kind of guys who are studying law, I just thought, oh, how dull. You know, what you want to be doing is doing plays and, you know, all of that kind of thing that I was into and hanging with the drama crowd. And if I learned anything making this film, it's that having an effective system of law is a really, really good idea. I mean, I'm a middle-aged man now, but I hadn't spent a huge amount of time thinking about the necessity of having an effective system of justice. And it's interesting, Philippe is more and more interested now. Now he's also a middle-aged man. He's more and more interested in following creative projects and stuff like that. So, but because this film very deliberately asks a viewer to imagine what it's like for there to be no court, no judge, nobody saying this is right and this is wrong, and it's all very straightforward, because the experience of the film is meant to blur those lines of moral certainty. Making the film made me feel like I was going to get lost in that, like maybe the actions of Horst's father is excusable. And it brought me back to one very plain difference between Hans Frank and Otto von Wächter, which is that whereas Otto von Wächter evaded and escaped justice and no court ever sat in judgment of him, Hans Frank was indicted, by a court for the murder of 4 million people. And somehow that fact has huge cultural weight, and we can all accept he did that. That happened. It was wrong. A court have presided over that. And, the process of making this film has made me feel that is a very, very, very important thing for a society to be able to do.